mine! Get away from it! Security, move in! Don't touch it! It's the wrong bag!
Zuri Fields is an exhausted waitress whose life upends during a high-end airport lounge security breach. In the chaos, she accidentally swaps her bag for one containing encrypted ledgers belonging to a criminal syndicate. Park Tae-hyun, a notorious Korean mafia boss watching security footage, recognizes Zuri as the girl who saved his life years ago. Now wanted dead by a ruthless enforcer named Kite, Zuri is thrust into a world of deadly secrets. When Kite kidnaps her brother, Jalen, Zuri must overcome her hyper-independence and work with Taehyun's fixer, Lee Sang-wook, to reclaim her family's safety. The waitress didn't realize she had picked up a death sentence until her phone buzzed with a bounty. But the Korean mafia boss watching the security feed recognized her face instantly. The airport terminal hummed with the frantic energy of 1,000 people going nowhere. It was a double shift, the kind that blurs the edges of the world until everything looks like a smudge of gray. Zuri Fields was just trying to reach the exit, her fingers numb around the handle of a brown paper shopping bag, when the alarms began to scream. Security gates slammed shut like iron teeth. In the sudden, violent surge of the crowd, Zuri was knocked to the polished floor, her own bag sliding away into a sea of identical shadows. She grabbed the nearest one, her breath coming in ragged hitches, and scrambled toward the light of the mall entrance. She didn't look back until her phone hissed a notification that froze the blood in her veins, a digital flyer with her own face and the words, "Wanted Dead." Zuri didn't scream. She looked at the red, "Wrong Bag" tag on the handles in her hand with the flat, tired realization of someone who has already survived too many bad days. Across the city, in the back of a black sedan, Park Tae-hyun stared at the monitor as his hand paused over his phone. His expression remained a mask of stone, but something behind his eyes shifted the recognition of a debt 7 years old. He didn't see a target. He saw the girl who had once helped him vanish when the world wanted him dead. The terminal floor was a blur of polished stone and panicked feet. Zuri didn't stop to think. She let instinct take the wheel, weaving through the closing security gates just before the magnets locked. The brown paper bag felt heavier now, its handles digging into her palms like a tether to a life she no longer recognized. Behind her, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots echoed against the glass men in dark suits who moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose. She burst through the terminal exit into the connecting luxury mall, a labyrinth of high-end storefronts and artificial waterfalls. Her phone buzzed again, a frantic vibration against her thigh that felt like a ticking clock. She ducked behind a marble pillar, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps, and looked at the screen. The "Wanted Dead" alert had migrated from a private message to a dark web bounty board. Her face was there, grainy and startled, captured by a security camera only minutes ago. "Move, Zuri," she whispered to herself, her voice a thin thread of steel. She pushed into the center of the mall, hoping the Saturday crowd would swallow her whole. But the crowd was thinning, people sensing the predatory energy radiating from the men fanning out across the upper balcony. Caleb Kite, Madsen's enforcers, didn't care about witnesses. They only cared about the ledger. She reached the central fountain, the roar of falling water drowning out the sound of her own heart. There was nowhere left to run. 2 men emerged from the shadows of a boutique to her left, their hands reaching inside their jackets. Zuri backed away, her heels catching on the lip of the fountain. She clutched the bag to her chest, her eyes darting for an exit that wasn't there. Then, the air in the mall seemed to change. A shadow detached itself from the glass elevator. Lee Sang-wook didn't run. He moved with the lethal fluidity of a blade being drawn. Before the first gunman could level his weapon, Sang-wook was there, a blur of charcoal wool and tempered violence. He caught the man's wrist with a sickening crack, disarming him in a single economical motion. The second attacker lunged, but Sang-wook pivoted, delivering a strike so precise it dropped the man before he could even cry out. Zuri froze, her back against the cold stone of the fountain. watching the boss's fixer operate with a terrifying, silent grace. Sang-wook adjusted his earpiece, his gaze never leaving the remaining threats on the balcony. He stepped toward her, his presence a shield of cold iron, and held out a hand. His voice was a low, gravelly calm that cut through her terror. "Stay down," he said, echoing the message on her screen. "I'm here." Above them, the hunters paused, their target no longer unguarded, as the shadow of Park Tae-hyun finally reached the light. The black sedan moved through the city like a predatory ghost, the rain slicking the pavement into a mirror of neon and shadow. Zuri sat in the back, her knuckles white as she gripped the paper bag that had dismantled her life in a single afternoon. Beside her, Lee Sang-wook remained a statue of lethal silence, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. They didn't go to a police station or a hospital. They pulled into the underground garage of a glass and steel monolith that looked like a fortress of legitimate wealth. When the elevator doors opened on the penthouse level, the air was different, heavy with the scent of cedar, and the humming silence of absolute control. Zuri was led into a sprawling office where Park Tae-hyun stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. He turned slowly, his sharp features catching the dim light, looking every bit the boss the digital alerts had warned her about. "Sit down, Zuri," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that vibrated with an authority she instinctively distrusted. "I'll stand," Zuri snapped, her chin tilting upward in a gesture of defiance that felt like the only weapon she had left. She didn't look like a girl who needed saving. She looked like a woman who had been handled by the world before and was ready to bite the hand that offered her a cage. "I don't know who you are, and I don't care what you think I owe you for that stunt at the mall. I want my brother, and I want out of this suit and tie nightmare." Taehyun didn't flinch at her sharp tone. He stepped toward the mahogany desk, his movements measured and graceful. "Kite Madsen does not stop once a bounty is live. To him, you are a loose end. To me, you are a guest." "A guest?" Zuri let out a dry, harsh laugh. "I've lived in this city long enough to know that when men like you offer a safe house, it just means the locks are on the outside. I'm not a project for you to fix." Taehyun paused, a flicker of something, perhaps memory softening the hard lines of his face. He slid a file across the desk toward her. "I am offering a deal, Zuri. Stay here, under my protection, until the ledger is neutralized. In exchange, your brother's tuition and your safety are guaranteed." Zuri looked at the file, then back at the man who seemed to know her name far too well. The high-end furniture and the silent guards at the door didn't feel like sanctuary. They felt like the bars of a gilded cell. She had spent her life fighting for a sliver of agency, and now she was being asked to trade it for a life she didn't choose. Just the job. She whispered, her voice hardening. "No debts, no favors. If I stay, it's because I'm choosing to, not because you own the floor I'm standing on." The following days were a study in orchestrated silence. Zuri moved through the penthouse like a ghost haunting a glass cathedral, her eyes constantly tracking the man who never seemed to sleep. Lee Sang-wook. He was the quiet shadow in Park Tae-hyun's world, a presence felt rather than heard. From the edge of the sleek, minimalist kitchen, she watched him through the open door of the security hub. He didn't just monitor screens. He lived within the data, his fingers dancing across keyboards with a rhythmic, deadly efficiency that made the air in the room feel thin. She saw him handle a breach on the perimeter not with shouting or sirens, but with 3 low-syllable commands into his earpiece and a single precise adjustment to a thermal map. It wasn't just a job, it was a science of violence. Watching him, Zuri felt the true scale of the war pressing against the triple-paned glass. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding over a bag. It was an invisible conflict involving encrypted ledgers and men like Kite Madsen, who operated in the red spaces of the map. The realization chilled her more than the central air. She was a single, fragile thread caught in a web that spanned the entire city. high above the main floor, in a room bathed in the blue glow of a dozen high-definition monitors, Park Tae-hyun watched her. He didn't look at the tactical feeds or the stock tickers. His focus remained on the small screen showing the library where Zuri stood, her hand tracing the spine of a book she wasn't reading. To his men, she was a liability to be guarded. To the world, she was a bounty to be claimed. But as he watched the way she held her shoulders, tense, defiant, refusing to break, he saw the girl from the community center 7 years ago. He remembered the copper taste of blood in his mouth and the cold rain of the alleyway where he had collapsed. He remembered a young woman who hadn't asked for his name or his pedigree, but had simply tucked him into a back room, cleaned his wounds with shaking hands, and stood guard at the door until the dawn broke and his hunters moved on. She had been the one person who saw him as a man instead of a throne. Now, he watched her through the lens of a camera, a debt he had carried for nearly a decade finally coming due, while she looked at his world and saw only a different kind of darkness. The silence of the penthouse was broken not by a command, but by the soft click of a door. Tae-hyun stepped into the library, his suit jacket gone, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled back to reveal forearms corded with the tension of a man who lived on the edge of a blade. Zuri didn't turn away from the window, her reflection a ghost against the glass. "You're wondering why a man like me would risk a war with Kite Madsen for a waitress," he said, his voice closer now, stripped of its boardroom armor. Zuri finally turned, her eyes narrowed in the dim light. "I'm wondering what the catch is. Men in this city don't do favors unless they're looking for a return on their investment." Tae-hyun stopped a few feet away, respecting the boundary she had drawn in the dust of her mistrust. 7 years ago, I was a different man. I was young, arrogant, and very nearly dead. I had been ambushed in an alleyway 3 blocks from a community center where a girl was finishing a late shift. Zuri's breath hitched, a faint, flickering memory of a rainy Tuesday night, surfacing a night she had buried under years of survival. "You found a stranger bleeding out in the trash," Tae-hyun continued, his gaze unwavering. "You didn't call the police, and you didn't ask what kind of trouble I was running from. You just dragged me into the back room, stitched a knife wound with a sewing kit, and gave me your own dinner because you could see my hands were shaking from the cold." Zuri looked at him, really looked at him. Seeing past the sharp suit to the jagged scar she remembered tracing on a stranger's shoulder. "I thought you were just a kid in a gang who got in over his head. I didn't think I was saving a future kingpin." "You weren't saving a kingpin. You were saving a human being," Tae-hyun said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am not keeping you here out of pity, Zuri. And I'm not doing you a favor. I have carried the weight of that night for 7 years. To the world, I am a boss. To you, I am simply a man paying a debt that has been overdue since the moment you told me to keep my head down and wait for the dawn." The air in the library shifted, the cold walls of the penthouse feeling, for the first time, like something other than a cage. Zuri saw the sincerity in the set of his jaw, a debt of honor that superseded the ledgers and the violence. She didn't offer a smile, but she didn't pull away when he took a step closer. The mystery of the boss had unraveled into something far more dangerous, a connection she couldn't ignore. The fragile truce inside the library was shattered not by a word, but by the frantic, high-pitched chime of Zuri's phone. It was a video call from her neighbor, Mrs. Gable. When Zuri swiped the screen, the image didn't show the elderly woman's face, but rather the wreckage of Zuri's hallway. The door to her apartment hung off its hinges, the wood splintered as if hit by a battering ram. Zuri's breath hitched as the camera panned into her living room. The sanctuary she had spent 2 years building for her brother was gone. The sofa was slashed open, stuffing spilling out like white entrails. The kitchen table, where Jalen did his homework every night, had been flipped and smashed. But it wasn't the broken furniture that made the air vanish from Zuri's lungs. It was the wall above the television. scrawled in jagged black spray paint, was a single word: kite. Beneath it, a Polaroid was pinned to the drywall, a candid shot of Jalen walking home from his after-school program, unaware of the shadow trailing him. "He's not there, Zuri. Mrs." Gable's voice wavered over the speaker. "The school called. They said someone picked him up early. I thought it was you." The phone slipped from Zuri's hand, clattering onto the mahogany floor. The scale of the war she had glimpsed earlier had finally breached the walls of her private life. She turned toward Tae-hyun, her eyes wide with a cold, paralyzing clarity. She had worried about the ledger, about the mafia, about her own safety, but she had been looking at the wrong target. Kite Madsen wasn't interested in trading ledgers with a waitress. He was interested in leverage. Tae-hyun was already in motion, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Sang-wook, get the feed from the middle school, now." Zuri grabbed Tae-hyun's forearm, her fingers digging into the expensive silk of his sleeve. "He has my brother," she whispered, the hyper-independence she had worn like armor for years, finally cracking under the weight of her terror. "He doesn't want the bag. He wants me to break." Tae-hyun looked at the wreckage on the small screen and then back at Zuri. The debt of honor from 7 years ago had just become a race against a clock he didn't control. The boss was no longer just a protector of a girl from his past. He was the only thing standing between a ruthless enforcer and the one person Zuri had left to lose. Outside, the city lights twinkled with a newfound cruelty, a reminder that in Kite's shadow, nowhere was truly safe. The digital grain of the school's security footage flickered on the wall-sized monitors in the command center. Zuri watched, paralyzed, as a black SUV with tinted windows pulled to the curb. Jalen appeared, his backpack bouncing as he walked toward a man who stepped out of the vehicle, a man whose face was obscured by a low-profile cap, but whose posture radiated a casual, lethal confidence. Jalen hesitated, then climbed inside, thinking perhaps that this was the safe ride Zuri had promised him. The SUV vanished from the frame in a blur of gray. Zuri collapsed into a chair, the air leaving her lungs in a jagged, broken sob. For a moment, the hyper-independent waitress who had stared down the darkness was gone, replaced by a sister whose heart was being torn out in real time. Her hands shook violently against her knees. This was her nightmare, the high-stakes war of the powerful, finally consuming the only thing that mattered to her. "We have his location," Tae-hyun said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, tactical precision. He turned to Lee Sang-wook, who was already checking the slide of a suppressed handgun. "Take 2 teams, go to the industrial district, neutralize everyone, bring the boy back." "No," Zuri said. The word was small, but it cut through the room's frantic energy like a blade. She stood up, her shaking hands clenching into fists at her sides. The breakdown had lasted 60 seconds. The hardening took only 1. Her eyes, wet with unshed tears, were now as hard as the glass walls of the penthouse. "Zuri, this is a tactical operation," Tae-hyun said, stepping toward her, his expression softening with a concern she no longer had time for. "Kite Madsen is a monster. My men will handle this. Your men will go in there and start a war, and Kite will kill my brother just to spite you." Zuri snapped, her voice vibrating with a terrifying newfound authority. "He took Jalen because of me. He wants the bag, and he wants me. If he sees your soldiers coming, he'll end it before you reach the door." She walked to the desk and picked up the brown paper bag, the leather handles snapping against her palm. She looked at Tae-hyun not as a victim, and not as a project, but as a woman who had spent her entire life navigating the margins where men like him didn't see. "I'm leading this," she said, her tone a final, unnegotiable door slam. "Sang-wook can be my shadow, your men can be the perimeter, but I walk through that door first. I'm the only one Kite will let get close enough to pull Jalen out." Tae-hyun looked at her, seeing the waitress who had saved him 7 years ago, the one who had refused to move during the robbery. He realized then that he couldn't handle her anymore. The vanishing act was over. Zuri Fields was stepping into the light. The industrial shipyard was a skeletal landscape of rusted cranes and hollowed-out shipping containers, the air tasting of salt and old iron. The rain had slowed to a persistent icy mist that clung to Zuri's hair as she walked down the center of an empty warehouse, her footsteps echoing like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. She clutched the brown paper bag to her chest, her knuckles white, her service uniform now a stark contrast against the grime of the docks. At the far end of the bay, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single hanging work light, stood Caleb Kite Madsen. He was leaning against a stack of wooden crates, his posture casual, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. Jalen was beside him, bound to a metal chair, a strip of silver duct tape over his mouth. The boy's eyes were wide and wet, but he stopped struggling the moment he saw Zuri. "Right on time, Zuri," Kite called out, his voice rasping against the corrugated metal walls. "I was starting to think the boss had talked you into staying in that pretty glass cage." Zuri didn't stop until she was 20 feet away. She didn't look at Kite. She kept her eyes locked on Jalen, projecting a calm she had to manufacture from the rawest parts of her soul. "I'm here, Kite. Let him go, and the bag is yours." Kite laughed, a dry sound that carried no humor. He pushed off the crates and walked toward Jalen, resting a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "See? That's the problem with people who have something to lose. You think this is a negotiation. It's not. I take the bag, and then I decide if the two of you are worth the paperwork of letting you live." He pulled a serrated blade from his belt, the metal catching the amber light. Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't flinch. She remembered the robbery at the diner, the way the air felt when a gun was in her face, and she let that same stillness settle over her. She knew something Kite didn't. High above in the darkness of the rusted rafters, Lee Sang-wook was a shadow among shadows. He was motionless, his eye pressed to the thermal scope of a suppressed rifle, his breathing synchronized with the wind rattling the roof. He wasn't waiting for a command, he was waiting for a heartbeat. "The ledger is encrypted, Kite," Zuri said, her voice dropping into a steady, dangerous register. "The moment you touch him, Taehyun's servers wipe the data. You'll be standing here with a handful of scrap paper and a death warrant." Kite hesitated, his blade pausing an inch from Jalen's throat. For the first time, the casual confidence in his eyes flickered. He looked at Zuri, really looked at her, and saw the same woman who had looked at a gunman like he was a leak in the ceiling. He realized, too late, that he wasn't the only hunter in the room. The silence of the warehouse didn't break, it shattered. The first shot from the rafters was no louder than a dry branch snapping, a muffled puff of air that sent a spark off the concrete just inches from Kite's boot. It was a warning, a surgical strike that signaled the end of the conversation. Kite lunged for Jalen, but Zuri was already moving. She didn't wait for a hero. She didn't wait for the mafia to save her. She threw the heavy bag directly into Kite's face, the encrypted ledgers acting as a blunt force distraction. As Kite staggered back, Zuri dived for her brother. She knew these docks. She had grown up 3 blocks away, playing among the rusted skeletons of the shipping industry when the world felt less heavy. She grabbed the legs of Jalen's chair and tipped it backward, using the momentum to roll him behind a rusted steel pillar just as Kite's men opened fire. The warehouse erupted into a symphony of chaos. Sang-wook's precision from above created a perimeter of fire, picking off the enforcers who tried to flank the pillar. But Zuri wasn't watching the shooters. Her focus was on the serrated blade Kite had dropped in his confusion. She scrambled across the oil-slicked floor, her fingers closing around the handle. With 3 frantic, jagged cuts, she sliced through Jalen's restraints. "Run to the crane, Jalen. Don't look back." She screamed over the thunder of gunfire. Kite emerged from the shadows of the crates, his face a mask of bloody rage. He ignored the snipers, ignored the war unfolding around him, and fixed his eyes on Zuri. He lunged, his hands reaching for her throat, but Zuri didn't shrink. She used the weight of a heavy iron chain hanging from a nearby pulley, swinging it with a desperate, primal strength that caught Kite in the ribs, sending him sprawling. She almost made it to the exit. She was feet away from the rain-slicked dock where Jalen was hiding behind a heavy tractor when she heard the scuff of a boot behind her. Kite had recovered, a hidden backup pistol leveled at her spine. He never pulled the trigger. The side door of the warehouse slammed open, and Tae-hyun was there. He didn't fire a weapon. He moved with a cold, terrifying elegance, closing the distance before Kite could adjust his aim. Tae-hyun caught Kite's arm, twisting it until the bone gave way with a sickening pop, and the pistol clattered into the bay. Tae-hyun didn't finish it. He stood between the broken enforcer and the woman he had spent 7 years remembering. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He stood as a shield, a silent acknowledgement that the victory belonged to her. Zuri stood on her own feet, her chest heaving, her service uniform torn and stained with grease. She looked at Tae-hyun, then at her brother, and finally at the wreckage of the men who thought she was a project. She wasn't saved. She was free. The rain had returned to a soft, rhythmic drumming against the roof of the black sedan, a soothing contrast to the violent percussion of the shipyard. Inside the car, the air smelled of expensive leather and the faint, ozone scent of the cooling city. Zuri sat in the back seat, her shoulder touching Jalen's as the boy drifted into a restless sleep, his head heavy against her arm. For the first time in days, the crushing weight in her chest had eased into a dull, manageable ache. Park Tae-hyun sat across from her, his silhouette sharp against the passing neon of the city. He had replaced his torn shirt with a fresh one, but the stillness in his posture remained a quiet gravity that no longer felt like a threat. Between them, on the floor of the car, sat the brown paper bag. It was crumpled, stained with salt water and grease, its power to destroy lives finally extinguished. "It's over," Tae-hyun said, his voice a low vibration that stayed below the sound of the rain. "Kite is gone. The ledgers have been returned to the vault. Your name has been scrubbed from every board in the city." Zuri looked at the bag, then up at the man who had built a fortress to protect a 7-year-old memory. "And what about the guest status? Does the elevator still only move when you say so?" Tae-hyun didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed. "The penthouse was a necessity of war, Zuri. The war is finished. You are free to go back to your apartment, or anywhere else you choose." Zuri watched the blurred lights of the midtown skyline. She thought about the empty fridge, the hole in Jalen's shoe, and the way the world looked at a waitress with no powerful friends. She thought about the precision of Sang-wook and the quiet honor of the man sitting across from her. "I'm keeping the job," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But not as a debt, and not as a favor. I want a contract. Market rate, benefits for Jalen, and a title that doesn't involve me hiding in the library when the real business starts. I've proven I can handle the noise." Tae-hyun nodded slowly, a gesture of profound respect. "You were never a project, Zuri. You were an equal I hadn't learned to recognize yet. The terms are yours." The car slowed as it approached her neighborhood. Zuri reached down and picked up the wrong bag, handing it to him. It was a simple exchange, a return of a death warrant that had become a bridge. As the sedan pulled to the curb of her familiar, flickering street, Zuri woke Jalen gently. She stepped out into the cool night air, no longer a woman running from a shadow, but a woman walking toward a life she had finally authored herself. Tae-hyun watched her go, the red glow of the taillights fading as she disappeared into the lobby, finally home, and finally heard.